First of all, thank you so much to the Holberg Committee for inviting me to be a panelist alongside two of the scholars, Dr. West, Dr. Butler, whose work I've admired for so long. It's really an honor to be asked to participate in this conversation about an issue I regard as incredibly important, but also very complex. And like Judith and Cornell, I actually think it is important to start with the question, since it's the topic, of what do we mean by identity politics? And to me, it is one of those terms that eludes any precise definition, any sort of platonic form. It reminds me a lot of the words terrorism or even political labels like liberal and conservative. They kind of mean everything and they mean nothing. And they sort of get defined through their functionality rather than as fixed terms, making them a little bit elusive to discuss. So I think what we do have to focus on is not so much what do we mean by identity politics in some abstract sense, but how is it being deployed? How is it being used in our discourse and in our politics? And I suppose you can look at identity politics in its most benevolent form in a way that is quite positive. And for me, I use my own life as a prism in which to understand identity politics in its best and its most admirable form. The formative experience of my life was coming of age as an 11-year-old or a 12-year-old in the early 80s with Ronald Reagan and the moral majority in their political ascension, learning and discovering that I was gay, having no idea what that meant, at a time when homosexuality was almost never discussed publicly except in association with an actual literal disease that was horrific, where the images were mortifying of people emaciated and dying and nurses afraid to care for them, and internalizing the idea that it was not just a metaphorical sickness, but an actual sickness that had defined my identity. It's an incredibly difficult burden for anyone to have to internalize and try and navigate, let alone someone who doesn't have the emotional skills to try and process something like that. And my whole life has been defined in some way by that societal inequity, going all the way to 2005, which is pretty recent, right? Not the 60s, not the 80s, but 2005. I met my husband in Brazil. We fell in love, decided we wanted to be together. But at the time, there was a law in place called the Defense of Marriage Act, enacted only in 1994, signed into law by Bill Clinton, overwhelming bipartisan support, that barred the federal government from granting immigration rights or any other spousal-based rights to same-sex couples that opposite-sex couples automatically would receive, which for us meant at the time that if I had fallen in love with a Brazilian woman instead of a Brazilian man, she would have immediately gotten a green card. We would have been able to live together in the United States, but because it was a he and not a she, there was no possibility of living in my own country with the person who I had decided I wanted to live my entire life with. And so we were forced to stay in Brazil. And obviously being in Brazil, most people don't weep for you when you say you're forced to live in Rio de Janeiro, but the injustice of that was a major factor in my life. And now I have not just a same-sex marriage, but an interracial marriage, an interracial family. We have 2 sons we've adopted, a 3rd child for whom we have guardianship, none of whom is white, in a country where systemic racism is a problem. We have to have those kind of conversations about why it is that when they leave the house, it's urgent that they have their identification, even though the white kids they're playing with don't need that. It's because the police will stop them and be suspicious of why they're there, when that's not true of their white friends. And so the idea of combating those sorts of injustices that are based on demographic identity and group membership, to me, is not identity politics. It's what Judith said earlier. It's identity politics that have fostered those injustices. The idea that heterosexuals have rights that gay people don't, that white people have privileges and are expected to be treated a certain way that non-white people don't. Combating that to me is not identity politics. Combating that to me is warring against identity politics, this kind of tribalistic notion of justice that some groups are entitled to rights and privileges to which other groups are denied. And that's the kind of identity politics to which, to the extent that label is applied to that, they don't think among decent people by definition is particularly controversial. I think any decent person, by definition, is opposed to the idea that what race you are, what sexual orientation you are, what gender you are, should define what your rights and privileges under the law are, or even under cultural and social mores. That doesn't mean everyone agrees with that. I mean, every decent person by definition agrees with it. And I think polls show and legal changes show that increasing numbers of people do agree with that we're headed certainly in the right direction, whether fast enough or not. We're certainly, that's the progress we're making. And like any progress, it's generating some backlash, but I think even with that backlash, it's still on the right path. Where I think identity politics gets trickier and more problematic is when it ceases to be about ending those kinds of categorical privileges, and where the perception at least is, if not the reality, that it's about fortifying them, but maybe in different ways. In 2018, I interviewed Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez during her primary run against then Congressman Joe Crowley, and it was at the time when almost nobody knew who she was. I know it's impossible to believe there was ever a time in our lives when no one knew who AOC was, but I promise you there was. It was very recent. I interviewed her when she was unknown, and one of the questions I asked her, she was a young Latino woman challenging a white male incumbent. I asked her, what role should identity politics play in your election? What role should your race and his, and your gender and his, play in the decision that voters in this district make when deciding who they should send to Congress? What is your view on identity politics when it comes to those kind of questions? Should people vote for you because you're a Latino woman and he's a white male? And she said, look, my view of identity politics is, of course, diversity and representation matter, but the concern I have with it is that it's so often used as a deceitful Trojan horse, is what she called it. That status quo centers of power can recruit different faces that look like they represent change because they're on their surface more diverse, but in reality they become tools to protect the status quo, to create a false perception that there has been a radical change, when in reality they're actually there to strengthen the status quo. I think the election of Barack Obama in 2008 was perhaps the best illustration of that. Again, no decent person could have been anything other than emotionally moved on January 20th, 2009, to see him and Michelle and their two daughters walk into the White House, given the race to the United States. But then the next 8 years was very much a kind of continuation of the neoliberal order of the Democratic Party. It was a historic event in one case, but it not only didn't radically change much, but in a lot of ways, the appearance of that kind of change was weaponized to entrench the status quo further. And I think this has become an increasingly potent tool of institutions of authority. One of the most disturbing for me was 2 years after we did the Snowden reporting in 2013 and 2014, showing that Western intelligence agencies had instituted a program of mass surveillance. In 2015, the GCHQ, which is the British counterpart of the NSA and more extreme and even less legally constrained than the NSA, if you can believe there is such a thing. It's sort of the kind of yappy bulldog that the United States farms out its surveillance wishes to the British when they can't do it themselves. Literally bathed itself in the rainbow flag. They lit up their futuristic, creepy UFO-style headquarters in the rainbow flag and said, we have had famous gay code breakers who we drove into suicide at the time, and now to kind of rehabilitate our image, we're going to celebrate our LGBT employees. The CIA releases videos celebrating Women's Day and the diversity of their agents. Corporations put Black Lives Matter logos on their Instagram page, and it dresses up these pernicious institutions with a mask of benevolence that doesn't actually change what's underneath. So one thing that concerns me is its weaponization, its cynical weaponization in many ways. And then the other concern I think that a lot of people have, myself included, is that sometimes the discourse that emerges from what may be well-intentioned and benevolent efforts to end certain kinds of discrimination have the effect, or maybe even the intention, implicitly or explicitly, to be divisive further in how we think about different groups, that we talk not about humanity meeting on its common ground, but this group or that group being inherently more violent, inherently more domineering, in a way that I think is encouraging people to start to judge each other, not as individuals, but as members of groups, like we did 50 years ago, but maybe with a different formula. And, I guess to me, the ultimate objective is when I think about the success of Bernie Sanders' 2016 presidential campaign, the shocking, improbable success of a campaign with no money, no institutional support, that came very close to defeating the Clinton political machine, and probably would have absent interference that wasn't particularly ethical on the part of the DNC. What the success was, it brought together people not based on demographic identity, but based on a multiracial working class coalition, which to me, in terms of defeating the excesses of militarism and imperialism and corporatism, is our only way out. And I'm concerned at some points that discourse that's intended to, or is dressed up as social justice, is further dividing us along these traditional categorical lines or demographic groups in a way that's making that ultimate goal more elusive than ever. I'm finding this conversation fascinating. I'm, doing a lot of thinking as I'm listening. I think one of the things that Judith said at the very beginning is something I just want to focus on for a second, which is noting the lack of women of color participating in this conversation, and what impact that exclusion might have, or that addition might have on the conversation. To me, this gives a really great window into the complexities of how we talk about identity politics. So you can certainly imagine that if you were to, we obviously have racial diversity and gender diversity and sexual orientation diversity and other kinds of diversity on the panel. It's true we don't have a woman of color. So how does that exclusion affect the discourse? How might its addition alter it? It depends a huge amount on which women of color you decided to integrate into the conversation. So we could, for example, imagine that we invited Kamala Harris or Stacey Abrams to participate in the conversation. They would be a woman of color. That would maybe change the conversation in a little bit of a way. Maybe it wouldn't. You could pick Nikki Haley or Tulsi Gabbard or Condoleezza Rice or Candace Owens, all women of color. That would probably change the conversation even more. And then you could pick,
Wouldn't just change it, brother. It would be more impoverished. But go right ahead.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying it'd be better or worse. In fact, that's exactly my argument,
I just
right?
want to be explicit about what the impact it would have.
Yeah, and maybe, and I think in some senses it may not have an impact, depending on who it was. And then you could imagine, for example, picking someone who isn't well known, who's somebody who's a single mother and unemployed, or works as a construction worker, as a police officer, who's a woman of color, who probably would bring a vastly different view than any of those other people that I named, and would change the conversation in much different ways as well. And so I think it's difficult to predict if you say, well, what would our conversation be like if we added a woman of color? Because the range of views that a woman of color would bring would be so wide-ranging, depending on who they are and what their position in life is. And I think, one of the things that always interests me so much is, if you look at elite discourse about, say, law and order and the police, and this kind of, slogan that arose in the last year from the murder of George Floyd, of defund the police and the like, that has a lot of currency among kind of elite guardians of discourse of all races. And then you look at polling data of poorer communities, Black communities, brown communities, and you say, do you think there should be fewer police in your communities, more police, or the same amount? The overwhelming majority of people in multiracial working class communities will say, I want the police in my community either as much as they are or more. And very, very few will say I want fewer. And I think as well that when you look at the lack of diversity to the extent you want to analyze it on the panel, you can of course say, well, there's not a woman of color, but there's also not someone who, say, is a member of the working class. I grew up in a working class family.
Okay.
I grew up in a working class neighborhood, but let's be real. Let's be real about what our lives currently are. We're people who have spent a lot of time in elite academic institutions, who have a lot of career and economic stability because of that. So you could bring a working class person into this discussion as well. Somebody, I don't mean who has working class origins as I do, and I believe probably everyone here to some extent does, but someone whose life right now has been defined by being a member of the working class and all of the hardship that has entailed over the last 20, 30 years. A white man, for example, from a town with shuttered factories and opioid overdoses, and that would bring an entirely different perspective as well. And so I think when we talk about diversity, it is important to think about the full range of diversity and not just a certain kind, because in so many ways the life in America is, you could certainly argue, defined at least as much by one's class as by one's sexual orientation, gender, or race. And I feel like a lot of times in identity politics discourse that gets overlooked. Just a couple of points, on the issue of how we think about diversity and diversifying thought and the like. For me, journalism provides a really interesting window into some of the difficulties. One of the big changes in journalism over the last, say, 6 to 7 decades is the corporatization of journalism.
Absolutely.
And with that has meant that, in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, without romanticizing that era, it was often the case that journalists didn't have college degrees at all. And yet now, in most national newsrooms, they've made great progress, not enough, but great progress, diversifying from the perspective of race and gender and sexual orientation, huge increases in the number of women and Black and Hispanic and gay people working in the major newsrooms, the major national media outlets, and yet almost all of them, the percentages rapidly increasing, come from the same set of 30 to 40 elite colleges. And sometimes I wonder, as we celebrate the diversification of newsrooms, whether that really is a diversification of newsrooms, in the sense that if you look in the modern United States at, say, a white woman and a Black man who grow up in an upper middle class neighborhood or even a rich neighborhood with parents who are partners at Goldman Sachs or ophthalmologists or venture capitalists, go to the same schools, live in the same neighborhoods, end up working in the same job. Obviously, there's going to be some difference in their experience by virtue of the fact that they're different, they have different identities from a perspective of race and gender. But I think you can make the argument that their experience might actually be more similar than, say, the white man who grew up that way and ends up at that job versus a white man who was born into a mining town in the Appalachians and lives in a town in Pennsylvania where opioid overdoses are overrunning the town and has to work 3 jobs at Amazon and Walmart and has no health insurance and has no ability to start a family, lives with his parents because of economic deprivation. If you're not including people like that in the conversation and in the discourse and in the newsroom, to what extent are you really diversifying? And to what extent are you kind of doing a more superficial form of diversity that, though valuable, certainly better than the alternative, is almost like a way of avoiding the more difficult kind of diversity? That's one point. And then the other point I wanted to make just about the kind of far-right populist backlash that Judith was talking about in France, but we've also seen it obviously here in Brazil, where Brazilians for 4 straight elections voted for kind of a left-wing, certainly center-left party, the Workers' Party, founded by Lula da Silva, a factory worker, a union leader, and then suddenly in 2018 went all the way over to the other direction and voted for a far-right figure, an authoritarian, Jair Bolsonaro. It's something we've seen repeated over and over. After 8 years of President Obama, people voted for Donald Trump. Millions of people twice voted for Obama and then voted for Donald Trump. And we can kind of look at these trends and say, you know what this is? This is white people engaged in racial backlash and resentment politics and anxiety over losing their privilege, having their kind of racist impulses stimulated by saying, look, we're being replaced, as Judah said. And definitely there's a part of the appeal of these movements explicitly aimed at that. But I think we also have to consider that Trump and people like him, or Marine Le Pen, or Jair Bolsonaro, or Brexit and Nigel Farage did not appear out of nowhere. They were the byproducts of an ideology that has destroyed the economic security of millions and millions of people who feel as though the elites, whatever racial diversity or gender diversity you want to put on them, no longer really care about their lives. And that perception, you could certainly argue, and I would argue, there's validity to it. And I think one of the most interesting dynamics is if you look in the United States and you would read elite discourse over 4 years about Donald Trump being kind of the new Hitler, a white nationalist, somebody who does nothing or little more than stimulate the worst bigotries among us, you actually see an increase, a big increase in Hispanic support for President Trump and for the Republican Party, some mild increase in the support of African Americans, though certainly much smaller. Overwhelmingly, they're still voting Democrat, but it's going in that direction. And I think we have to be careful that we don't kind of take this reductive explanation of why this kind of populist nativist politics is finding success. We can call the people who support it racist, say that they're just concerned because immigrants are entering the country, because Muslims are entering the country, Africans are entering the country. But I think in doing that, we kind of bury another factor, which is that neoliberalism has been an incredibly cruel ideology on an economic level. And this anti-status quo, anti-elite sentiment that is driving a lot of it, and that their demagogues are successfully tapping into, in a lot of cases, isn't racism, as evidenced by the fact that it's getting multiracial support, but this kind of growing cleavage between elite discourse over here and the lives of ordinary people over here. And I think kind of just dismissing it away with a simple explanation or a kind of one-stop shop explanation that these are just racists concerned about their racial privilege doesn't tell the whole story and might actually make it more difficult to combat, to understand what the appeal of it actually is.